Good afternoon, good morning, or good midday or middle of the night, wherever you are. Welcome to our first attempt at a Fragment video conference. As I said, this is the first time we're trying this, so we ask for a little bit of patience. My name is Bill Duba. I am the project manager of Fragmentarium. I'm also admitting people while we speak here. So, and our plan is to have once a month, roughly, talks on things related to our fragments, fragmentology, and fragment-related materials. So it's great to have such a reception and so many people here today. And we're very excited to present our first such talk. It plans we should run about an hour with the presentation and discussion afterwards. Our first presentation will be by Dr. Laura Albiero. Dr. Albiero is an associate member of the Institut de Recherche et d'Histoire des Textes Paris, or the IRHT, or deeper still, the IRHT. She is, as you can imagine, a specialist in manuscripts, fragments, liturgical texts. She has numerous publications, most recently with Isabelle Drelance. She has published a collective volume, Les Sciences du Quadrivium au Mont-Cassin, Regard croisé sur le manuscrit Monte Cassino, Archivio dell'Abbazia 318. Previously, she has a monograph, Le Fonti Liturgico-Musicali della Diocesi di Como, and she has dozens of articles, book reviews, manuscript descriptions, quite what you want. Before she came to us to work with Fragmentarium, she was at the Polanski project, so she knows quite well the collection in Paris as well as in Oxford. Today she'll be talking about the work that she's doing with Fragmentarium. It's a collaboration between Fragmentarium and the Bibliothèque nationale de France, which is made possible with the generous support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Okay, without further ado, I will pass the word to Laura Albiero. She'll present and we can have a discussion afterwards. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Bill. Please tell me if you hear me loud and clear. Okay. So this Fragmentarium project focuses on fragments kept at the Bibliothèque nationale de France. And I would say that there are two main reasons for choosing the National Library of France. The first one is related to the importance of the collection kept at the BNF. With its 370,000 manuscripts, both medieval and modern, the BNF preserves one of the richest manuscript collections in the world. The second reason is related to the cataloging history of the BNF. The great part of its manuscript collection, in fact, has been catalogued more or less in detail in a time where the interest for fragments was not so profound. Printed catalogs have been converted into the online catalog, and it is the online catalog, the online version, that is actually implemented. As you know, manuscripts at the BNF are not uniformly described. So we have very detailed descriptions for some manuscripts and very short reports for others, as in this case. At the time of this catalog, in the 18th century, catalogers highlighted the fragments when they had a particular historical or paleographical or ornamental interest. For example, pre-9th century leaves, fragments written in nuptial letters, or with decorated initials. But most of the time, fragments were considered as mere binding material, and sometimes they were not even mentioned in the description. For example, We have here manuscript Latin 7005 that looks not very interesting. It's a medieval manuscript written in medical manuscript written in the 17th century on paper. It comes from, we see here the collection of the Cardinal Mazarin, and it is mentioned in one bibliographical reference. This is all the information we have about it, but when we look at the manuscript itself, we see that its binding look like this. And this is a whole different story. This binding is pretty interesting for researchers who study fragments, and in particular, liturgical ones. And this is precisely the importance to spot the fragments, to make them known, describe them, catalog them, because a fragment or a manuscript that is not cataloged basically doesn't exist. This is also an example of the fact that fragments, even at the BNF, have never been systematically studied, and sometimes we discover their content for the very first time. The BNF Manuscript Collection is organized according to the language. We have Greek, Latin, French, German, Italian, etc. The present project focused on the Latin collection, which is divided into two parts: the Latin, over 18,000 manuscripts, also divided into the old collection, the new collection, the Saint-Germain, Saint-Victor, Sorbonne collection, and the Petit Fond, the smaller collections, and the Nouvelle Acquisition Latina, which contains 3,260 manuscripts acquired from 1868. So where are the fragments? Fragments are almost exclusively binding material used in manuscripts or printed books. We actually have three types of emplacement for the fragments. First of all, we have fragments that are still attached to the host volumes as covers, flyleaves, base downs, or as a support of the spine or other parts of the binding. Second, we have detached fragments that are kept in boxes and still have to be ordered. Detached fragments, finally, we have detached fragments that have been gathered and put together to form a new manuscript, or what we call a fragment volume. Our project focused only on the third case. Most of the fragment volumes were put together between the 19th and the 20th century. They gather together binding waste removed from printed books, now kept at the reserve at the François Mitterrand site, or removed from manuscript books of the BNF, or from books or of other French libraries and archives that were at some point sent to the BNF. Traces of the previous host volume are not always evident. Sometimes the fragment displays a former shelf mark, a title, or a stamp, a title of the previous host volume, of course, or a stamp. For example, this fragment was used as a flyleaf of a volume, and it has a former shelf mark, 30.2, and a title in German. The title and the shelf mark perfectly correspond to the actual manuscript German 148, and the dimensions are a match too. But most of the time, we are not able to detect from which host volume the fragment comes. This other fragment, for example, shows the stamp of the Archives de la Manche that are in Saint-Lô in Normandy, These fragments were found there and then sent to the BNF, probably in the 19th century. So fragments have been removed from binding and kept apart. We don't know how much time passed between the moment of the removal from the previous host volume and the moment they were put together to form a new manuscript. Sometimes we have mentions of the new bindings in the modern archives of the BNF. Some other times the documentation is more reticent. There is another element that has to be taken into account to determine when the fragments were put together. And that's the stamp of the National Library, which changed from one period to another. So according to the period, we have stamps from the Royal Library, the Imperial Library, and the National Library. We have a study made by Pierre Josserand and Jean Bruno that places stamps in a chronological order from the 17th to the 21st century, but it refers only to the printed volumes. And there are specific stamps for manuscripts that don't exactly match the stamps for printed books. Moreover, fragments as well as manuscripts could have been stamped years or decades later after their acquisition. Besides that, some of the stamps that we find on fragments could refer to the previous host volume, as in this case. This 8th century fragment in Merovingian script has a stamp that was usually destined to printed books. We see the mention IMPR for imprimé, actually identical to Josserand Bruno 31, dating from the third quarter of the 19th century. Studying these fragment volumes, we observed that there is sometimes a consistency in the way fragments were put together. That is according to the origin of the fragment collection or according to their content. For example, Latin 9377 is the result of the collecting of fragments that have been sold to the Royal Library in 1833 by the widow of the philologist Jérémie Jacques Oberla. He was the brother of a Protestant minister in Strasbourg, and he was interested in the ecclesiastical history of his city. He visited many libraries and archives, and he formed a small private collection of documents and manuscript fragments. So this particular volume preserves the collection of its previous owner and indirectly keeps intact its coherence. In certain fragment volumes, we can see that there has been an effort for coherence regarding the content. These are 3 examples of fragment volumes where the leaves have been gathered together thematically, as we have a collection of liturgical fragments, a volume of theological and juridical fragments, and another of scientific and literary fragments. But the exceptions are much more frequent than the rule, and we have volumes with fragments that differ by content, origin, and provenance, and dating. In some cases, fragment volumes don't respect the provenance of the fragments, as we can observe that fragments that belong to the same original manuscript appear in different fragment volumes. Here is an example. These 2 fragments, now folio 64 and 65 of Latin 11411, were part of an 11th century manuscript that transmits the Jewish war written by Flavius Josephus. Other fragments from the same original manuscript are now in 2 other fragment volumes of the BNF. We have 4 partial leaf, from Latin 10,400 and 2 leaves from Nouvelle Acquisition Latine 2389. So here we have to be very careful and don't jump to conclusions, because the fact that the fragments belong to the same original manuscript doesn't mean that they were binding material of the same previous host volume. But they were surely binding material of books that had the same provenance. Now, the first 2 fragment volumes were put together before 1871. The Nouvelle Acquisition Latine volume has been put together at the beginning of the 20th century. That means that fragments have been removed from bindings, kept apart in a sort of reservoir, and then chosen to form new manuscripts at different times, according to criteria that are not completely clear and that do not necessarily respect their previous emplacement or provenance. The reconstructions of these fragments shows that Latin 10,400, folio 24, and Latin 11,411, folio 65, are part of the same original leaf, as well as folio 33 of the first manuscript and 64 of the second. All these fragments are now in the Fragmentarium Platform, each one with a detailed description and images imported with the IIIF protocol. The interesting part is that in the Fragmentarium Platform, we can make a virtual reconstruction of the original sequence of fragments according to their text order, even if they actually are in different manuscript collections or manuscript volumes. Here is the reconstruction and the description of the content in the virtual reconstruction, while the codicological data are given in the presentation of each single item. In this case, the text was pretty easy to recognize, but in other fragments, the identification of the content is far more challenging. Identifying the content of a fragment is usually much more difficult than identifying the content of a whole manuscript, because we don't have a complete text. We don't usually have a valuable incipit for a text or a chapter. And I'd like to underline here the fact that in the process of identifying a text, the collaboration between experts of different disciplines is vital. I personally benefit every day from the advices and information that colleagues send to me. And I really like to thank them for the valuable contribution that they provide. The interest of the BNF fragments is multiple. First of all, the presence of pre-Carolingian fragments whose content has not been analyzed in detail. This beautiful 8th century Anglo-Saxon sacramentary, for example, previously used as a paste down of a volume, contained the masses for the common of saints. So nothing specific. The fragment has been described in low Codices Latini Antiquaris, in Klaus Gamber's repertory of ancient liturgical sources, and in Birgit Ebesberger's work on the Anglo-Saxon manuscripts at the BNF. The fragment has been generally attributed to Northumbria without any other precision. Prayers in themselves don't display any particular feature, but at the end of the Common of the Martyrs, there is a long benediction that was said by the bishop in some liturgical occasions. That means that the recipient of the original book was a bishop, and the primary destination has to be searched among the episcopal centers of medieval Northumbria. The second point of interest of fragments is the rarity of the uniqueness of the text. This 14th century fragment, for example, contains a medical text which talks about nervous disease, written in a quite regular script, but the text hasn't been identified yet, and it doesn't contain an incipit nor a title, nor a rubric that could help in the identification. The third reason of interest resides in the fact that fragments are a non-typical observation point for studying the history of book collection and the library practices. In his researches, Gilbert Huy retraced the manuscripts kept at the library of St. Victor's Abbey at the beginning of the 16th century. The chef mark of Claude de Grandroux catalogues, completed in 1514, were usually inscribed on the flyleaves of the St. Victor's manuscripts. St. Victor collection was almost entirely acquired by the National Library during the French Revolution. As several bindings of this collection have been remade after the manuscripts entered in the National Library, it's precisely in the fragments that we find traces of these ancient shelf marks. This fragment, for example, that contains the Digestum for Justinianus, displays the 16th century shelf mark along with more recent shelf marks for which there is no catalog, so the underline and the crossed out numbers. These marks help to retrace the organization of the St. Victor's Library, and they also help to connect fragments to manuscripts, and they reflect the library procedures in the rebinding of volumes. Over 40% of the fragments at the BNF are liturgical, and it is actually the case for most of the libraries. We all know that liturgical books were periodically renewed in order to be updated with the new feasts and newly canonized saints. And that's why a great part of the fragments come from liturgical manuscripts. As a researcher on liturgical disciplines, I found the research on fragments particularly interesting and challenging. The number of unpublished texts is huge compared to other textual types, and the BNF has revealed some real surprises in this respect. This fragment belongs to a monastic antiphonal written in the 12th century in the Rhine region. It displays 3 completely unknown antiphons for the second nocturne of St. John the Evangelist. And here, the musical notation is also particular. It belongs to the German type, but it has some specific features that appear only in Western German sources. And Michel Huglot talked about notation rhénane for this particular type of notation. Paleographical music features are another point of great interest in the research on fragments. Fragments make us more aware of the incredible number of different types of musical scripts, and they display nuances, hybrid forms, and even notation that are difficult to classify. Each pneumatic notation is specific of a determined geographical area, so they constitute an amazing tool for localizing fragments. This one clearly comes from an Italian antiphonary. The notation, called nota romana, is typical of central Italy, and even the textual script is very specific. It is called Romanesca, a type of Carolingian minuscule used in Rome in the 11th and 12th century. Paola Supino Martini devoted a monographic study to this particular script, adding an exhaustive list of sources, but she didn't mention this fragment. And the fragment is also unknown to the Iter Liturgicum Italicum, published by Giacomo Baroffio in 2011. This missal is a beautiful example of Lorraine notation, used almost exclusively in Eastern France. Even in the fragment dates from the beginning of the 12th century, the notation is still in campo aperto without lines. In southern France, we find Aquitanian notation, as we see in this fragment that transmits some tropes for the ordinary of the Mass. The origin of liturgical fragments is not always easy to detect. When the notation cannot help, we can rely on some other liturgical details as the feasts of saints. These other fragments, the fragment, for example, dates from the 13th century and it originates in northern France. It contains part of the office for Saint Monica, and all the texts are unique as far as we actually know. The sanctoral is a primary source for new pieces, since the proper office for a saint may contain newly composed antiphons and responsories. This is exactly what happens in this other antiphonal from Senlis, near Paris, copied in the 13th century. Saint Regulus, who was Bishop of Senlis, has a complete proper office whose texts have never been published. In the Fragmentarium Platform, we have described more or less 350 BNF fragments. 224 fragments are already published and more are coming in the next weeks. It is difficult to evaluate the total amount of fragments kept in the BNF because we don't have a precise inventory of them yet. And I would say that even the definition of fragment could be the object of interpretation. For example, the BNF preserves composite volumes of 5 or more codicological units, where one unit could be a single quire or less than a quire, as in this case. Should we consider them fragments, or should we grant the status of fragment only to leaves or bifolia that are detached from the original quire? The same question can be applied to dozens of volumes that gather charters which are put together according to their subjects. Should we study them as fragments, or are they rather a collection of original non-fragmentary documents? Whatever the answer to this question may be, the quest for fragments at the BNF continues to bear fruit and to uncover its richest treasures. The Fragmentarium Platform has supported this research in the most efficient and ergonomic way possible, giving a proper space for the description and allowing the import of images. This one-year project have encountered not only precious witnesses of our past and an excellent data structure, but also an environment of remarkable people who improved my researches with suggestions, corrections, questions, encouragement, and fruitful discussions. I'd like to end this presentation by expressing my deepest gratitude to all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And we'll give our virtual applause and proceed straight to the question section. Now, okay, so Peter Toth asks, have you encountered fragments in Greek?
Yes, there are Greek fragments too, but there is a project at the IRHT that is called Pinakes. I encountered once a fragment that was not in the database, in the Pinakes database. So I just send the reference to the people responsible of the database. So basically, you will find in Pinakes all the fragments at the BNF.
All right, so Peter, thanks very much. And from Antoni Iglesias, he asks, have you encountered fragments in Catalan? So
in Catalan language,
yeah.
As a language or as a provenance? As an origin?
Well, both, let's say. Have you found the language or provenance? Language is a question.
Language, no.
Mm-hmm.
As an origin, yes. There are some fragments in liturgical fragments in Catalan notation.
Mm-hmm.
Very few.
Okay, and the director of Fragmentarium, Christoph Fluler, asks you if you're able to talk about your upcoming project, Fragmenta Parisianzia.
Yes. So as you probably all know, because it has made public, I will work in next 4 years to another project involving fragments. And it is a fragment that will study, it is a project that will study fragments kept in different libraries and archives in Paris. So I will go through other fragments at the BNF, mostly in situ fragments at the BNF. Besides that, there is the Bibliothèque Mazarine, the Sorbonne Bibliothèque, the Sainte-Geneviève Bibliothèque, and the Archives nationales. They keep, I think, some maybe 1,000 fragments in boxes that are not cataloged yet. So that's basically my work for the next 4 years. So it's all new for me. I know more or less what I will find in the BNF because I went through some manuscripts already. But for the other libraries and archives, I really don't know what's in there. So it's a surprise.
Okay. Vito Santoliquido is asking about literary texts. Have you found fragments of those in this section?
Literary, yes. So there are fragments, classical fragments. There are also fragments in Old French. Mm-hmm. So some chanson de geste or something like that. But on French text, there is another project, always the IRHT, the Jonas project. And so all the manuscript and fragments in Old French you will find there. And for literary text, yes, there are also Latin literary texts. Yes, this is not the most frequent case I've found.
Let's see. All right. So next in line is Robert Andrews from up north now at the moment. He asks if there are in the bound volumes, in your fragment volumes, are both sides of the fragment accessible? And what's the physical experience like? Okay.
Most of the time, yes. Because they are, so in French we say monter sur onglet. So we have a stripe or paper and the fragment is like that and the fragment is attached here like that. So we can see the recto and the verso. But I have some fragments that are glued on a paper support So I can read only one side, and I suppose that on the other side there's nothing, but I'm not really sure.
Wow, we get many comments here coming through. Thomas Valmagna has a comment that we'll just read into the record, saying, thank you to call attention to Latin 2825. It is possible to tell that these pieces were collected from the library of Jacques Auguste de Thou between the second and third recension of the catalog. So yes, these must be considered as fragments, which were not put together in the Middle Ages, but after 1617. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. You're welcome to.
Yeah, I studied this manuscript or fragment collection in a previous project, and I think that it was Etienne Balouse that assembled the different fragments together, as he was used to do when he was in the Colbert Library. Mm-hmm. So that's a hypothesis.
Okay. Fran Alvarez says, many thanks, Laura. Have you come across any fragments with bilingual texts?
With
bilingual texts? You know, say like Latin and the text in German on the side or something.
No. No. In one of the Anglo-Saxon 8th century fragments, there are some glosses in old English, I think, or old Irish, something like that. But it's the only case I found so far.
All right, well, let's see what we have here. We had Vito again had a quick follow-up saying that he's interested in your new project, wants the name of it again, and interested in old French fragments in particular.
So the project is called Fragmenta Parisianzia because it's focused on fragments that are kept in different libraries of Paris. So I'm interested, and I'm much more skilled on liturgical fragments, as you probably all know. So I will focus on them. But when I go through a fragment collection, I usually keep a sort of register of all the fragments that I found. So I don't know if I will be able to photograph them all yet, but that's what is in my head for now.
All right. Let's see. I think next on the list is Margot Fossler, who, well, there's a good answer to this one. Asked you to speak about fragments from Chartrain Scriptoria. So what do you got from Chartres?
Just a fragment for now. Yes, I think that's one of the fragments that was recently discussed in Twitter. That's the only fragment from Chartres that I have for now.
So we'll make sure you can see that one for the moment. But okay, next is Holger Kosik. I hope I didn't get his name too badly massacred. Many thanks for an interesting and insightful presentation. Are Italian fragments being updated to the Iter Liturgicum Italicum? And is a repertoire being updated at the moment in general?
I should have done it, but I didn't. Yes, there is a database which is based on the Giacomo Baroffio publication 2011. And this database is implemented and enriched with the new discoveries. But the fragment I talked about is just the last one I discovered, And so I didn't put in the database yet, but I will. And I will next week.
So let's see, the next on our list is, I believe, Teresa Lupi, who says, that was really interesting and well presented. Well done. Have you noticed if fragments were predominant after the Council of Trent when there were changes in the liturgy? So parchment folios were recycled as covers.
It's difficult to say because most of the binding are modern bindings. So it's difficult to say, or at least for manuscripts. Yes, maybe yes. But I would say that liturgical fragments are thrown away when a new manuscript was copied. So the old one was not useful anymore. But yes, it's difficult to say. But I don't have seen many medieval bindings with liturgical fragments. There are, yes, of course.
So basically, so you would say that your project, since it's working largely with fragment volumes that were bound in the 19th and 20th century, it's difficult to make that jump and say that this was done at that point.
Yes.
Thomas Falmagna wants to know some more about those unknown fragments and boxes that you were allowed to see last year.
Okay. So there are about 20 boxes at the BNF. That have fragments that comes from bindings from the BNF and other libraries and archives. There are a bunch of modern fragments as 18th century registers, but we have also medieval fragments. There is an ongoing project with Francesco Siri. We are planning to write an article on this particular collection. The problem with these fragments is that they are not cataloged. They don't have numbers on them. So when a reader goes to the BNF, he doesn't, he can't ask for them. So they are not available for a reader. And that's the problem. Yeah, I think they should be put into new volumes, fragment volumes, or I don't know, maybe organized in a way that they are communicated to the readers, but this is not done. And I think it will not be done in the next years. But yes, we have a trace of these fragments. So we have a list with a general identification for the content, and I hope that we will publish an article next year.
Okay. Next on the list there is Peter Toth, and he says he thinks he's identified Nouvelle Acquisition Latine 2317, folio 19. That was the fragment you showed, the medical text with the Hippocrates aphorisms and Galen on that.
Yeah.
So he thinks he has an identification of it.
Yeah,
and like some info, we said, I think we all say, yeah, great.
Great, thank you.
All right. So in the chat, you can all see that Lisa has pointed out the Chartres fragment for you. Christoph Fluler, again, says that there are a total of 41 fragment volumes at the BNF. Could you tell us when they have been made? or collected, gathered together, and if the collectors had tried to document their work?
Okay, so the fragment volumes were put together between the 19th and 20th century. For some of them, we have a more precise time span. But most of the time, we don't have any record of how librarians proceed, how they choose the fragments, where they kept them. So no, we don't have any record of it.
Okay. Now, Bart Jaski of the University Library of Utrecht asks, merci, Laura. Did you encounter decorated fragments, or were these handled differently by the librarians?
Yes, there are some. So as most of the fragments were binding materials, well, we all know that a beautiful manuscript has had more chances to be preserved entirely and not to be dismembered for make other binding materials or fly leaves or press downs. So the rule is that fragments don't usually display a nice decoration or an important decoration. But I have 2 or 3 cuttings of initials that are actually fragments, and they are in a fragment volume of the BNF. So this is not the more frequent case, but there are some.
Okay. Now we have a question from Godfried Kroenen of the MMFC project, and it's medieval manuscripts and Flemish collections, I believe, in Belgium. And he asks, do you think the system used by the BNF of mounting the fragments on stubs in bound volumes is a good one? Could they not be better stored loose in envelopes, which interferes less with the fragments?
I absolutely agree.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem of the BNF is to make fragments available in a way that they are not manipulated too much by the readers. So, for example, modern papers that are unbound are more the object of subtractions. And so this is the primary preoccupation of the BNF is to, yes, we have to make the fragments available for the readers, but they cannot just take a leaf and put aside and steal it. So that is basically why they formed these volume fragments. But I'm absolutely agree, because in this form, so fragment volumes are usually of huge dimensions. So I have to consult, when I consult them, I'm always standing, I'm not sitting. And so I have to take the measures and the dimensions. And if I have to read the first lines, I am always on on this huge volume, and this is not very practical for manipulation and for reading. And I think for the fragment, it's not the best. Also for conservation practices. So yes. I agree, but this is the choice of the BNF.
Okay, we have a couple more informational notices that I've recorded here. Peter Toth has sent the identification of the text for us to confirm.
Great.
So we'll look at that. And Veronica Drescher, my colleague here in the Fragmentarium headquarters, points to another fragment from Chartres, possibly the same manuscript. That's been published as well. So there's that there. And next comes Matthias Tischler, who says, did you come across fragments which did belong to manuscripts used by the Maoris and then were lost? You find anything like that?
No. No, not yet. There are some fragment volumes that are put together by the Maoists. I recall a fragment volume put together by Jean-Michel Briard, which was he was a Maoist, and so he put together this fragment collection. But I don't recall any fragment of manuscript that has been lost. No, not yet.
Not yet. Matthias Tischler is announcing that together with Walter Pohl, I am running a new project on manuscripts from Septimania and Catalonia since September 2020. And he has a link and says, if you come across unknown items, please let me know. Wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, all right. In that case, I wanted to let's thank you again, Dr. Albiero, for a wonderful talk. Our next presentation will be on Friday, November 6th at 4 p.m. Central European Time, when Professor Jacques Szojinski, Director of the Birkenmeier Institute for the History of Science, Polish Academy of Sciences, Warsaw, will present the Manuscript PL project. Thank you all for coming.